You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast. It's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. Now today, if you're a regular listener, you know that we cover indie games pretty much every episode on this podcast. Indie's such a big part of retro. And really, I mean, kind of look back at the history of indie games, kind of spawned out of those bedroom coders back in the 80s and 90s. So we thought we'd chat to this week someone who's actually authored an incredible new book via our sponsor, Bitmap Books. Little disclaimer, but we do love this title. 50 indie games that changed the world. So we thought, why don't we get on the author of the book for a bit of a chat about the history of indie games, some of the highlights from the book as well. So let's welcome him on, Aaron Porter. How's it going, Aaron?
Yeah, not too bad, Dan. Ravi, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on and chatting to us. I know just before we started recording, you mentioned that you're fresh back from Gamescom in Germany. So
Guten Tag.
What's it kind of like out there? Then much retro and indie there?
Lots of retro stuff, lots of indie stuff. The bulk of my time out there was spent during the business area, rushing back and forth between appointments. But every so often I did peer my head to the public halls and saw the raft of people. Apparently there was 500,000 people visiting Gamescom this year. So it really is the biggest games event in the world, which... I think we were saying this a little bit, like, I think we're so lucky to be like so close to it. Like it's just across the way. SGF is all well and good, but it does sort of feel like that's more AAA focused anyway. And at Gamescom, you get much more eclectic mix, smaller indies, bigger developers. It's nice to see everyone coming together.
100%. Well, I'm kind of interested a bit about your history. There's one question we always like to ask our guests to kind of find out your geek credentials, as it were. So, I mean, what originally got you into gaming then? Where did your journey with video games begin?
Yeah, I have this very distinct memory of my mum gifting me a Sega Mega Drive one Christmas. And I didn't know at the time, but obviously it was her hand-me-down Sega Mega Drive. Sonic the Hedgehog was my very first game. So that original Sonic game, still one of the greats, in my opinion, of the 16-bit era, blowing into that cartridge and playing that stuff. I didn't think about it at the time, but as I get older, I'm kind of like, my mum wasn't a big capital G gamer. So I was really lucky that she sort of had that to begin with in the first place and then sort of passed it on to me. So from there, it was kind of like, trading cartridges with mates and playing stuff like Streets of Rage 2, Golden Axe, all the classics. And funnily enough, it was only about 10 or maybe even 15 years later that everyone promptly reminded me that Golden Axe was rubbish. But I actually thought it was pretty good when I played it back in the day.
Love Golden Axe.
Like Golden Axe gets a lot of hate, like, or at least in the circles that I am, but I've got a lot of love for that. So, and then from there it was off to the races, essentially, mainly a PlayStation boy in terms of the console sphere, and then obviously Nintendo Game Boy Color up to the DS and stuff. So yeah, a very varied gaming history, I think.
Well, magazines were essential, and even up to the PlayStation years, you get those demo discs on some of them.
Yes.
They were fantastic, and that was a good way of getting indie games around. I remember Net Your Rose was one where people were developing indie games on the PlayStation. I was just wondering, what magazines were you reading back then? And
yeah, it's funny that you mentioned magazines and demo discs specifically, because I feel like those demo discs with like the thick black number from the PlayStation magazines were just kind of everywhere. I would see more of those than I would the actual magazines that they were from. And I remember very distinctly playing the demo for Siphon Filter, the original one on PlayStation 1, just over and over again. That darkly lit street area, entering a bank, I think it was, and then tasering people until they burnt up. That was really fun. But in terms of magazines that I grew up reading, the main one actually was Official Nintendo Magazine. And I think the main reason was because I didn't actually own a home Nintendo console until the Nintendo Wii. So I completely missed out on, 64, GameCube. So the reason that I would sort of beg my parents to like buy me Official Nintendo Magazine is because like, hey, I want to know what I'm missing. And that, okay, I get you guys aren't going to buy me the console, but I can at least read about these games, sort of like Super Mario, Super Mario Sunshine. And funnily enough, I'm probably like, giving away my socioeconomic sort of background history here, but I remember going to McDonald's as a kid and they sort of had like GameCubes with Double Dash and Sunshine playable. So that was sort of my interaction with the Nintendo stuff. So, and I still have, probably a bit of a sad thing to do, but I still have From one edition of Official Nintendo Magazine, they gave away these magnetic bookmarks, and I still have those to this day with like all the different Mario Kart characters on. So if you catch me reading a book, if I'm ever reading a book in public, I've probably got Luigi on a page somewhere. So that's quite fun.
Did you ever like read multi-system magazines? Like CVG was a good one, and learn about other systems and kind of like look at some of those games and be like, oh, maybe that's something I want to explore, you know.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't really. The only multi-format magazine I remember in my head was Games Master. And obviously there was the accompanying TV show as well, because that logo was just so like in your face and bold and stuff. So I think I definitely picked up a couple of issues of Games Master when I was a kid, or at least got my parents to. And the thing I remember about Games Master is just how dense that magazine was and random with stuff that was in its pages. It didn't matter what system it was on. It didn't matter sort of what type of game it was. There could be a very racy image of a woman promoting a game on one page, and then the next you could be reading about, you know, Gex or someone like that, or Bubsy, to maybe be a bit more relevant now, according to a new game that was recently revealed at Gamescom. Yes. And it was quite surreal. I don't know if we'll get into this a little bit later, but Games Master obviously no longer with us, but it is constantly a source of pride for me that I got to freelance for it a couple of times in its later incarnation before it was eventually sunsetted. So yeah, and then sort of similarly, more so than maybe even the demo discs and those multi-format magazines, I just remember like cheat books being a thing for like PS1 and PS2. I'd go over to my parents were separated when I was young, and I'd go over to my dad's on a Sunday, and more often than not, he'd be like, I got a new game in, Aaron. And he'd open the drawer, and right next to all the like PS1 game discs, there'd be like 3 or 4 cheat books, and it's like, oh, this one's got the GTA Vice City cheats book in, treasure it. So that was like my Bible growing up on games.
Yeah, it's definitely in those pre-internet days before we had iPhones in our pocket and everything, and had to rely on whispers in the playground or cheat books, like you said. I mean, you mentioned that you actually wrote for Games Master. I mean, let's talk about your games journalism career then. So how did you start writing about games then? What's kind of your path there?
Well, I chose the traditional avenue in that I did a history degree, which all game journalists have to do in order to get a job. No, I'm joking. So I basically got a job straight out of uni for a marketing company where I was required to write about windows, doors and conservatories Monday to Friday, 9 to 5.
Fun.
So, yeah. So if you need to know anything about heat transfer or composite doors, maybe that's still in the corners of my mind somewhere. But from there, it was kind of like, okay, I'm getting paid to write. That's really cool. And I really like playing video games. So why don't I try and make this sort of like, these worlds crossover? And then eventually I just started writing for sites, indie sites, where it was mainly for, I'll use the E word, exposure, which isn't always a good thing these days. But I was just happy to get my work out there, access to games. And then eventually it was just pitching editors, building up a portfolio and saying, hey, here's my stuff. Can I pitch you a feature about this topic? I think one of the first freelance pitches I got through actually was for Games Radar. And it wasn't technically about games. It was about the Castlevania TV show on Netflix, which had just recently debuted. So, and I think that's sort of, they were getting games pitches left, right and center, but in order to come up with like a, stand out and make myself, stand out a bit more, I pitched that, and it was successful, and it kind of rolled on from there, really.
You covered games preservation in one of your articles. I was wondering why that's so important.
Oh, yeah. Well, games preservation, it's funny you should bring that up, because obviously it's an ongoing debate now with the realm of Nintendo Switch 2 and like game key cards and stuff like that. I just think, I've always been a physical media fiend. I like buying discs. I like having them on my shelves, as you can probably tell behind me here. It's a bit cluttered at the moment. But I've managed to negotiate with my girlfriend so I can display stuff this way. I just think because not to sound too much like an old man or old man shouts at cloud, but I like being able to pass on my favorite thing to somebody else and the next generation. And I think that, I think we're kind of at the turning point now where we need to find a better way of preserving games that isn't just solely on a disc, because let's face it, the next generation of consoles, as we see it, likely won't have a disc drive, at least as the standard. So games preservation from any angle is good with me, whether that be, with physical media where you get a nice, swanky booklet, or if it is just granting players access to something digitally and not being stingy with it, as some of these publishers, not naming any names, can be from time to time, which I don't personally understand. So yeah, I don't know exactly what article you're referring to. I've written a lot of them, but it's nice to know that I was always championing games preservation, at least a little bit.
Well, obviously, Stop Killing Games has been a big movement recently.
Yes.
Trying to, basically force regulation to take care of it. I mean, do you think that's a good way to do it? I mean, have you got any thoughts on that movement?
So yeah, I've not really commented on it directly because I think it's obvious that, the frustrating thing with Stop Killing Games specifically is that the publishers are making out like they're being asked to do something which they're not. I saw their response. I think it might have been through the UK government or something, where they were like, we can't be expected to support these games for like 10 plus years. And, very clearly Stop Killing Games and, is it Accursed Farms, I believe is the YouTuber that started that movement.
Yeah.
He's been adamant. He's like, well, look, we're not asking you to support these games. We're just asking for you to develop online modes for them. Why is that so hard? And I'm 100% there with him. It's like, why can't you build in from day one, from the development process, a way that when you need to switch off the servers, the majority of the game, disregarding the online mode, still remains playable? I can't see why that's an issue personally. Even for, Ubisoft's game The Crew is what kicked this all off. They've got arguably one of the most online centric games in the division, but as long as you can like populate that with bots, I think there should be a way to play that long after the servers have been switched off. So I hope that the Stop Killing Games movement does pick up some speed, more so than it already has, even if it does need a villain, which ended up happening. So when I see players specifically that can't get behind a movement like Stop Killing Games, it's just completely alien to me, because if you're a fan of games, you should care about this and champion it.
Yeah, and with the amount of new games coming out all the time, and like you said, digital delivery, I think, it just gets increasingly more relevant and more important every year. And I mean, kind of leading on to that, obviously, we're going to talk about your new book, your first book, actually, which is dedicated to indie games. I mean, why are you so interested in indie games as a genre then? Because it sounds like you grew up playing the AAA stuff. What kind of sparked your interest in indie?
Yeah, well, I think I grew up playing like the AAA stuff just because that was what was on the shelf, really. Like, it was only when I sort of was older and, became more aware, started speaking to developers that were making games when I was a kid, frankly, where I learned about like the indie game movement and, sort of shareware, that whole scene in the 90s and potentially earlier. But I think indie games right now, like you said, Dan, there's so many games being released every year. The number is increasing year over year in just Steam alone. Like, it's becoming increasingly difficult for any game to get air. And I think you saw that towards the tail end of last year when even the weight and might of PlayStation released a live service game by the name of Concord. I don't know if anybody remembers it. And, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks later that the servers were switched off because the interest just wasn't there. So you can't sort of like flood the market now and hope that your game, even if it's a good one, will find its audience, because there are too many games and not enough players a lot of the time, specifically when you've got modern games like Fortnite and Roblox eating up the majority of the mind share of this stuff. And that is something that scares me. Like, I don't know if consoles will forever be around in the same fashion that they are now in terms of a unit that sits under your TV. But stuff like that, for as difficult a time as all games are having, like right now, indie games have always like struggled in some fashion. And I think, researching the book only emphasized that to me more. It's not in terms of just getting discovered, but just getting funded in the first place and trying to, get people to believe in their idea or get people to believe in the dream they have and the experience they intend for people. So, when you call a book something as boisterous as 50 indie games that changed the world, it's never going to be a complete sampling of what the indie game scene is possible of creating. But it's my way of sort of paying tribute to those early sort of successes and games with a big reputation that are sort of representative of the creativity and imagination that indie games as a genre, if it is even a genre, I explore this in my introduction, are capable of.
It's really interesting because different systems kind of opened up the world a bit for indie games, and you mentioned that shareware and public domain. I remember Xbox Arcade was a huge one, with indie games arriving on there, and then also Flash with Newgrounds, and it was like the democratization of kind of video games, and having people involved. And what are your memories of the kind of history and the roots of it?
Yeah, so I talk about this in the introduction of the book as well, and obviously Castle Crashers features in the book, which is my sort of like nod to the Flash scene. Speak to Tom Fulp about those early days, and I guess Super Meat Boy to a certain extent as well, because it started life as a Flash game, so that's kind of a good bridge. But my memories of that were going to the computer room at school and typing in miniclip.com, or I believe robot duck, it wouldn't be robot chicken with it, but something like that.com, and just playing these really bizarre games, a lot of stickman fighters I believe at the time. But you're right in terms of talking about how those games sort of now I'm going to put myself to shame here.
I find it hard to say as well, yeah.
It's late at night when we're recording, well, relatively late. It's 4 a.m. Democratized game development, because it meant that it was freely accessible to anyone who had the internet. The tools, although they weren't quite there yet, people were able to publish and develop games outside of the studio system and get them in the hands of people. They weren't making any money off of it, but it was just a great way to sort of experiment in those Wild West days of the internet, which, judging by recent months here in the UK anyway, might be coming to an end, unfortunately. So you're absolutely right to call out the Flash scene, because that is true, really and truly, the sort of like my first interaction of sort of like indie game development and sort of shareware development in any sense.
It's interesting when we think back to the 80s, when like the video games industry was really just starting here in the UK, and the amount of bedroom programmers that were around back then literally could be like a teenage kid in his bedroom who'd write a video game, send it to a company who'd then publish it. And obviously as the industry grew and systems got more capable and games got bigger, these turned into teams that now, are bigger than Hollywood movies. I mean, do you think the indie game developers are kind of the modern version of the bedroom programmer?
I would say so. At least that's the closest sort of comparison that we have now. Since games and the tools that are required to make them have become more freely available, and to their credit, companies like Unity, I know they've had some bad press within the past year or two, justifiably. Game Maker's Toolkit, Unity, these are all engines that are free to access and free to develop in until you reach the point of, publication and trying to like get that into people's hands. So in terms of, the book is filled with success stories of single developers, like starting off in their bedrooms, groups of university students that started off making a game as part of their course and then started their company. And even whilst, coming up against these, interviewing and researching for the book, I'm hearing these stories. I'm kind of like thinking to myself, oh my God, like I was 29 when I started the book. I'm 31 now. I was kind of like, God damn, I'm 29. I can't imagine graduating at 21 and then becoming the CEO of a company, employing people and having to pay them just so I can make Octodad Dadliest Catch a reality on the PlayStation Network one day. But these people did it, and they're still doing it 100%.
What I kind of love is the experimentation and the freedom of them. So one that you feature one game is Her Story, which is a very original concept. It's police interview tapes, and you're on an old kind of Windows 95 style computer. Do you think that indie games lead to that kind of experimentation in art and no risk and no kind of constraints as well?
Oh yeah, 100%. And even more so back in the day, sort of like the late 2000s, early 2010s era, when, in my opinion, the indie game, I don't want to say that the indie game scene was in its heyday, but it was kind of like all bets were off in terms of the kind of stuff you could put into a game mechanics wise and concept wise. Her Story is a great example of that. Like, it was the FMV video game genre, with games like Night Trap and stuff. Yeah. It was thought to be long since dead. And lo and behold, a great guy called Sam Barlow, fed up with making AAA games that have to sell a certain amount in order to be considered a success, decided to take what little money he had, rent out a hall at the council summit in Cornwall one day, and take an actor in there with him, and before you know it, he's got like an indie breakout hit on his hand. And fast forward to now, that little germ of an idea that is her story is still, it can be traced all the way back and all the way forward to today, where we're getting games like Immortality and obviously Telling Lies, which were his games before that. I don't think, even as the indie game scene was taking off and before her story came out, I could have predicted that FMV games would make a comeback. And there's no way that AAA games publishers like Activision, which are too busy, publishing Call of Duty once per year, were ever going to take a risk on games like that. I will hold my hands up and say there's certain like AAA, AA developers that obviously do tend to blur the line with FMV stuff. I think of studios like Remedy, and they've just had a great, what we think of as a success with Alan Wake 2, but obviously it's been very publicly documented that for as great a game as Alan Wake 2 is, which obviously features real life actors, was seen as a big risk by the studio, and only because of a conglomerate as big as Epic Games, the makers of Fortnite, because they bankrolled it. That was the only reason that Remedy was able to take such an experiment, and only up until very recently had the game paid for itself. So I think it's very interesting that indie games have always had to, weigh up these risks and sort of like, gamble their livelihoods in believing in their dream. But it's sort of, in some ways, kind of like sad to see that, like, even in the AA scene, the AA scene pretty much fell away during the Wii, PS3, 360 era, and now it's coming back again because indie games have sort of suddenly started to catch up, and they're looking a lot better. They're more well-rounded. These tools are out there now, so it's nice to see it come back. But in video game development today, nothing is a success. Nothing is a guaranteed success. Hence why wouldn't you go for that indie developer attitude and take the risk? Because, spoiler alert, I couldn't, before I wrote the book, after I was done doing interviews for the book, which took me about a year, and then I wrote it in 4 months, I was just hearing whispers and rumblings of a little game called Balatro. Balatro, what's this Balatro game? Poker, but it's also a roguelite, and it seems to be, okay, interesting. That's how we get things like Balatro, is by taking risks, and it's an indie game.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we tend to see with the indie game scene, and, again, the games that we cover on this podcast is, a lot of them do go for the retro kind of look. You get CRT filters, scan lines, chip tunes in them as well. We've had, you mentioned in the book, the rise of stuff like boomer shooters and Metroidvanias as well. I mean, why do you think the players and developers keep coming back to those retro styles? And do you think it's driven by nostalgia, or is it more like practical choices in easy game design?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, really. I think during the early onset of, the subject, the sort of timeline that the book talks about, there was a real hunger and thirst for recapturing people were suddenly able to make the games that they played growing up as a kid. And one of those was, quite prominent example was Thomas Happ when he made Axiom Verge. Very intentionally made it look like an 8-bit sort of original Metroid throwback, because he had that sort of, inkling to take the game he wanted and make it more accessible and approachable for a modern day audience. And obviously Nintendo, I doubt they're throwing around the Metroid license willy-nilly. So rather than do that, we get an amazing game in the form of Axiom Verge, which pays definite tribute to the games of the past and the games that he grew up with. We talk about in his chapter in the book about when he bought an NES, from his parents bought him an NES from Toys R Us when he was a kid. His first game was Super Mario Brothers, and then Metroid soon after that. But then even fast forwarding a little bit later, things like Shovel Knight, where I feel like Shovel Knight was sort of the first instance, or the first major instance, of an indie developer taking the aesthetic and design ideas of a retro game, like an 8-bit retro game, but then breaking it in some fashion in terms of doing things aesthetically and functionally that an NES game would never dream of being able to do. The sort of, even just a color palette alone, that game could not fit, on a traditional NES cartridge. So, and it's funny, we don't touch on these games so much in the book, but where I'm at now, I feel like every day, I'm lucky enough to do this as a full-time job. I write for the Mirror UK newspaper. I cover video games, and every day my inbox is flooded with like a 3D action platformer, the kind of which I grew up as a kid, something like a Croc or a Spyro the Dragon. And it's just like a team of 6 people made this. It took them like 2 or 3 years, but if you took that game and showed it to me as a kid, I'd be like, wow, this PS2 game looks good. So I don't think we're that far off that indie games, like the lines constantly blurring. Mike Bithell makes a really good point in the foreword that like indie games, they're just games. that just so happen to be made by people. Like, why does there have to be this, delineation between the two? So there was definitely that nostalgia to begin with, and I think it's going to catch up eventually until indie games and AAA games are just going to become just games.
I think it's really funny because we've been covering a lot of like Demakes on the podcast, which are kind of like, where they're taking a game and making an indie version of it that's really stripped down, like Halo 2600 was one. And we've seen a lot of indie games also get ported onto other systems, older retro systems as well, because I think it's maybe because they could be bothered. Have you seen any examples of those?
Yeah, I've not tried Halo 2600, but that sounds really cool. I can't even imagine how that would work. But yeah, I feel like there's a real, handhelds, handhelds are really in right now. Stuff like the Retroid and the Analog Pocket, if you can track one down. Again, I feel like, not to move away from your point, Ravi, too much, but I feel like certain hardware manufacturers and publishers are realizing that, younger people of a certain age aren't really interested in buying hardware anymore, because you don't need to play Fortnite on the latest machine. And so that's resulted in hardware manufacturers sort of going for the older audience, people sort of like our generation, essentially, where there's money to be made there. And, indie developers and smaller developers are seeing that too. I remember backing just a few years ago, this game called Good Boy Galaxy, about a sort of astronaut dog. And the whole hook behind it was that I'm developing this for a Game Boy Advance hardware. It is going to come out on Game Boy Advance. And then there are other examples of that as well. I think Tanglewood was one where that was designed to release on Mega Drive / Genesis. So I think those are really cool. I think it's great that we're in the space now where, yes, we're getting demakes. We're also getting high budget remakes of older games that look and play better than before. Night Dive Studios' recent remakes of Heretic and Hexen, I think, are a good example of that. But then I get a real kick out of stuff like, was it called Xenocrisis? The guys at Bitmap Bureau.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, which I imagine is a big favourite around here. They're really nice guys, and I'm really excited for their Terminator 2. Terminator 2 is my favourite film. I'm so excited for that game. And
it looks amazing.
It looks so good. And then we can just talk about that game for the rest of the podcast if you want. And they just recently announced the He-Man game, actually. He-Man bit him up at Gamescom. But yeah, I get a real kick out of when developers are challenging themselves in that way. The complete opposite of what I just said with Shovel Knight and Axiom Verge to release on original hardware, because I think that's really cool.
I think as well when they do that, when games come out on modern platforms, as we kind of mentioned before, it's hard to get that discoverability because there's so many of them. But I think when, if an indie developer then ports the game to like the Dreamcast, for example, then they're more likely to make the headlines as well. Mm-hmm. So I think, obviously we talk about them on the podcast then as well. So I think in terms of discoverability, porting these games or making them for the retro systems first can be good in terms of getting them in front of people, I think.
Yeah, like you said, is a news story, and it's like a novelty factor as well, isn't it? Mm. I don't know what your guys' experiences are with this, but I feel like I'll happily play a ROM for a game and play it on my Analog Pocket, and I do get a similar amount of satisfaction knowing the fact that the game I'm playing now can run on the original hardware it's intended for. But again, I don't really want to like name names or anything like that, but I think like the downside sometimes with that is that the wait it takes to get your original cartridge for that game is often so long that I'm a bit impatient. I'm like, oh, it exists right now and I can play it right now. Then I'm going to play it that way, and then maybe I'll get around to it on my Mega Drive, if it eventually comes through. But you're right, that's that sort of like blurring of the lines between retro and indie. They sort of share that same spirit where this seems impossible, but let's see if it can be done. And it always makes me laugh when like one of those games comes out where it's like, and it's being developed for, Game Boy Advance. Because I imagine the last person who developed a game for Game Boy Advance like 1 or 2 years ago was like, damn, I wanted to be the last person, but it was good while it lasted.
Oh, it's a competition, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I'm a fan of the Commodore Amiga, and the amount of new games for the Amiga I've got in the last 2 years. I think there's more Amiga games coming out now than there was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is nuts, yeah.
I'm sure I got to interview, but obviously the Atari 2600 Plus and all those new systems. One of the coolest experience I've had as an adult is taking first of all, dragging out my dad's original Atari 2600, which was a bundle that came with Pac-Man, I believe. Notoriously bad version of Pac-Man, but hey, it's Pac-Man pretty much. Being sent the Atari 2600 Plus, and obviously that came with a built-in, I think it was like a 10-in-1 cartridge that might have had a new game or two. But taking out the cartridge for that and putting in that original Pac-Man cartridge in the 2600 Plus, and there I am playing the same copy of Pac-Man that my dad played. That was like a super cool feeling. And I was lucky enough to interview Wade Rosen not too long ago, the CEO of Atari, and he was like, this was one of the first things I wanted to do when I came in, was bring back that tactility, bring back that fondness for physical media, so that people can pass on stuff that they shared as a kid. So the more that we get of that stuff, the better. I'm still waiting for a half decent version of the Sega Mega Drive. That was my original console to come out. Yes, Sega, you're doing some good stuff now, but like sort it out in terms of like who's making your modern mini Sega Mega Drives. Maybe feel free to tell me that I'm wrong, guys, but I feel like I always see one or two pop up every year or then, and there's always some compromise with it.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. Apart from the FPGA stuff, which obviously whole different world,
expensive, high level stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the book then. I mean, 50 indie games that changed the world. Available now from Bitmap Books. You can get it in a hardback. Beautiful, like all their books are. You get a PDF with that too. Weighs in at over 450 pages. So kind of give us the lowdown on what people can expect from the book, and what made you want to write it then? Where did the idea come from?
Yeah, no worries. So up until recently, 3 or 4 years ago now, I used to, 3 years ago, I guess, I used to write for a magazine in the UK called Wireframe Magazine. I was the features editor there for a while, and it was published by Raspberry Pi, who obviously have a bit of a hand in sort of like modern day game development, helping people code their own games. And our job was to write about the coolest games we saw, really. AAA or otherwise, indie, it didn't matter. And a unique selling point of the game was that we had a section in the middle of the magazine dedicated to game developers themselves, where we would tell people how to develop, this game, and hear from game developers. They would write the section. Sort of similar, and that baton's been picked up by something like Debug magazine now, and they've paid tribute to Wireframe. I did some stuff with them back in the early days. But as that magazine was sort of sunsetting, I'd reviewed a couple of Bitmap Books releases in the past. Funnily enough, when I left Push Square, they gave me the Game Boy box art collection. That was really cool. So I kind of like recognizing that whatever job I did next in the games industry probably wouldn't have much call for writing about indie games, because modern day video game journalism can be very like search based, and you have to chase the biggest stuff, Call of Duty, Fortnite, in order to keep your website afloat. That was before Google's helpful search update, which is another issue. Support independent websites. So I sort of on a whim pitched Sam Dyer, owner of Bitmap Books. I said, hey, it's been really good working with you, reviewing your stuff. I've got this idea of a book about indie games. And my original pitch to him, and I have the original email, was 50 interviews, 50 chapters, 50 indie games that changed the world. And Sam, to his credit, he was pretty much on board right from the get-go. He did say I think I pitched him at the right time, because he was pretty open about saying, hey, obviously Bitmap Books, we usually focus on retro games. That's kind of been our bread and butter, but we'd like to experiment with more modern stuff and more modern releases to see if there's a market and an appetite for that in terms of what we do. And he kind of agreed that, like, as what we were talking about earlier, indie games seem to be a pretty good bridge towards that, like coders in bedrooms, small teams, releasing it and funding stuff in unusual and ambitious ways. There was a lot of crossover there. And from there, it was basically sort of, I said to Sam, okay, this is the idea. I've got a list of games I want to get in this book. Give me a year to see if I can interview all these people. And after a year, I'll know if this thing's a goer. And luckily enough, it was. So the book is basically a celebration of this sort of modern, current incarnation of indie games that we're currently in, pretty much from 2004 right up until where we are now. So, roughly 20 years. The first game to feature in the book is Cave Story, which I think is like the first prominent example of a single coder making an indie game and releasing it to commercial success. And then the most recent game, I believe, is either Vampire Survivors or Sea of Stars. Sea of Stars itself being sort of like an unabashed throwback to that era of 16-bit JRPGs like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI, all that stuff. So I think it's like a really good capper in terms of people that are into retro games. So yeah, that's basically the book on the surface. Is 50 chapters, 50 interviews, 50 indie games that changed the world.
How did you go about choosing them then? And are there some that didn't make it? And also, just with us, we're always looking for guests and chatting to people. What was the hardest person to get in contact with? I thought that would be a good question.
Yeah, you're asking some $1 million questions there, Ravi. So in terms of selecting the games, I obviously did my research and, researched around in terms of like, okay, what indie games are considered the best of the best? Because I know the indie games that I talk to the people in my circle, I know the indie games that we love. Time to see if, it's loved by the general public and wider audience as much. And for the most part, that ended up being true. You're always going to see your Super Meat Boys, your Fezzes, your Binding of Isaacs, your Braids, stuff like that. So I knew that they had to be in the book. And then from there, it was kind of taking into account a little bit in terms of like, how they scored at the time, but more importantly, talking about sort of like the legacy and the conversation post-release. Because I feel like that's, obviously I'm tooting my own horn here, but that was a really big source of pride of the book, is that, in modern video game journalism or, game cycles, a game releases and for a week or two, it's part of the conversation and then it's quickly washed away by whatever game is out next. This was, the book was an opportunity to sort of talk about the legacy of these games as well as the sort of like initial making of them, finding out, hearing from the creators themselves. Oh, how did the release of the game change your life? And what are your thoughts on the game? Maybe in some instances, like 10, 15 years removed of when it came out. Are you still proud of it? What is the reputation you hope it has now, and how do you think it's influencing people? So that was good. And then from there, it was kind of like, okay, I need to make sure I'm representing different genres within indie games. So you get a bit of horror there, Metroidvania, roguelites, of course. Metroidvanias and roguelites, easily the two biggest genres that have come to represent indie game development these days. Probably, especially in the case of the latter, because obviously there tends to be a reliance on procedural generation and randomization within levels and progression, which helps indie games and smaller teams, develop them and make them give consumers a lot more bang for their buck, really. And, sort of things like Spelunky and Rogue Legacy were the start of that. So I've got like comedy game in there with like, Octodad, but then also, there were obvious choices like Among Us. That was the game that sort of defined COVID and lockdown. I wasn't actually somebody that actually played Among Us in lockdown. I was basically getting through my backlog, to be honest, guys. It was great, for certain reasons, it was a great time for me. So I had to do research for that. And yeah, to your point, it was a very important, and, me and Sam had a back and forth about this, and I sort of said it's important that every game features original interviews with insight from the people that made them. That's very important to me. And I think that was like a relatively new concept for Sam, because there were a couple of times where maybe a game was getting tough. We didn't know we were going to nail it down. And he's like, hey, why don't we just credit another source and feature comments from them here? And I'm like, I think that devalues the book a little bit. The idea that everything in here is, original really gives it value. And that's come to be the case now. In terms of the most difficult person to nail down, easily, the answer is twofold. So Toby Fox with Undertale was one, notoriously reclusive game developer, really quirky guy, and I've still never spoken to him face to face or video to video. Had to jump through so many loops and call in a lot of favors to sort of get responses back from Toby Fox in written form. So I'm pleased to have Undertale's story there, because that's, in terms of the cult an indie game can sort of generate, that is the sort of trademark example, and it's gone on to have this big reputation. The hardest game, without fail, was Limbo by Playdead. And Playdead is a team that is sort of going through some weird stuff right now. Certain founders have left and other people have left, and other people aren't really happy to talk about the studio in general, because they sort of pride themselves on this sort of mystique that they have, the creators of Limbo and Playdead, Limbo and Inside. So it was looking kind of dark there that Limbo wouldn't feature in the book as a full-fledged chapter. I spoke to multiple PRs, people at studios that have since spun up off of Playdead. I got a couple of yeses, and then at the final hurdle, it would be, no, we can't do this, it's not appropriate. Until eventually I tracked down the game's sole character animator, a lovely lady called Stine Sorensen, and and she basically worked as a contractor on the game for 6 months. But through her perspective, she was really willing to go on the record, and she was able to talk about sort of Arndt Jensen's and sort of role as creative director on that game, and her perspective of him working on the game the same time that she was, which gave me enough of an insight into the making of Limbo that I felt confident putting it in as a chapter. So I'm still not totally sure if any of the guys at Playdead know that Limbo features in the book, let alone with insight from behind the scenes. But there is a small anecdote at the end of the making of that game that I don't think has ever been publicly reported, and I'm not seeing many sites pick up on yet. So little stories like that are really, again, another reason why it had to be original. But yeah, Limbo was the hardest to get in there.
You mentioned about the art of the book as well there, and I think looking through it, I love the fact that you've got concept art and sketches in there too. And obviously Bitmap books are famed for, that they're art books, really. I mean, are you a bit of an art book nerd then? Was it important that it had that kind of look, that the art really popped out?
Yeah, I think so. I think it just made sense that, if you're going to talk about the making of these games and then the legacy of them, it makes sense to sort of, as much as possible, showcase the visual sort of growth of these games and how they took shape. I think, and to Sam's credit and to Bitmap Books' credit, like, I had the luxury of selecting what 50 games I wanted to choose in the book. And then once I'd sourced those interviews and written the chapters, the ball was very much in Sam's court to sort of work with those 50 games to source everything that he needed, right? Some of which was publicly available, some of which, like I just said with Limbo, perhaps not so much. So that proved a challenge. And it's been funny. This is the first sort of podcast and interview I've done now that the book's actually released. So it's funny seeing people, every game in the book, has essentially 8 pages dedicated to it, 2,000 word chapter. And there's been a bit of a conspiracy amongst some YouTubers and reviewers. It's like, but Downwell's only got 6 pages dedicated to it. What does this mean? Why has Downwell, been treated this way? And Sam would tell you himself that the basic answer is, like, no concept art was ever made for Downwell, so it was impossible to show any. So our workaround was to show the sort of like item pixel artwork for each of the items you can collect as part of that game and lay them out beautifully in a spread. So there's no conspiracy, guys. Every game in there is treated the exact same. It just didn't happen in terms of Downwell's case because that material literally does not exist. It was developed for phones originally, which in itself I think is an interesting note to take, in that, in terms of indie game development, a lot of this stuff is moving so fast and happens so fast. Archiving isn't really the top priority for a lot of these people. And to be honest, it's probably a modern miracle that somebody like Eric Barone, maker of Stardew Valley, has character sketches at all, considering that these people, those characters are rendered as pixels in Stardew Valley. So stuff like that's always really interesting.
Do you think we're seeing a kind of change in attitude towards indie games from the kind of mainstream consoles? The Switch is starting to get a lot on. Evercade is a great example of, taking on indie games as well.
Yeah, I think like indie games want to be anywhere they can in terms of platform and to reach the most people, as should be the objective of any games, right? I think, growing up, with PlayStation, I would constantly look over and see people with Xbox playing Gears of War, Halo, and be like, oh, I guess I'll have to go around a mate's house and kind of steal some time in order to play that. Whereas those walls, for one reason or another, are being constantly broken down now. But with indie games, they've always been there, as sort of, specifically the period that the book covers. Like Xbox Live Arcade was an amazing movement for indie games at the time. Games like Super Meat Boy, Castle Crashers, they're all coming out. They're all bangers, and that was an example, one of the earliest examples of a big platform like Xbox putting the spotlight on smaller games to sort of fill those gaps between big exclusive releases when even the third-party games weren't there. And I think you're right to say that the Switch, the thing about indie games is that each major platform has been the custodian of them at one point or another. So Xbox with Xbox Live Arcade, then we had PlayStation when the PS4 sort of came about as the most popular platform of choice. We also had the PlayStation Vita that was a companion console to the PS4 at the time. That was the natural home of indie games, and PlayStation did a really good at championing them. Then with the release of the Nintendo Switch, the first instance of Nintendo getting their act together in terms of digital distribution and eShop, people just naturally wanted to play games like Hollow Knight in the palm of their hands because it made the most sense. That in turn has led to, Steam, arguably maybe the natural home of indie games, and obviously all games because it's such a big behemoth, picking up that baton again with things like the Steam Deck and then other third-party handhelds. So it's very interesting that regardless of where you're playing, indie games will always be there because they're old enough now as a movement to have shuffled through every platform and they've built up those relationships.
As your book is a collection of games as well, do you think we'll be seeing more collections of indie games coming out? Because Humble Bundle was one thing that I really remember when I was younger, and that would have like a load of indie games. You'd pay a cheap price, there'd be charity in there as well, and you get some new exposure to titles as well.
Yeah, 100%. I think movements like Humble Bundle and Fanatical, like all those digital sort of outlets are really good, because by picking up a bundle, you could be picking up a game that you didn't know you sort of like were going to be into type thing. And I've sort of lost count how many times I've spent like £10, ended up with 5 games, and randomly when I'm going through my backlog, I've either read or watched something about an amazing indie game I didn't know anything about, only to find that I already own it. So I think that's like a good way of getting out there. And honestly, we've had sort of like specialist publishers that sort of make indie games their main remit. The most recent one that potentially comes to mind is .emu, who tend to publish a lot of sort of pixel based stuff. They recently released the new Ninja Gaiden game, actually, Ninja Gaiden Ragebound, which is really good. And again, that's made by a smaller team, a team called the Game Kitchen, whose first game, or not their first game, but first major game, Blasphemous, features in the book. And the only reason they were given, the trust and the license to work with a major brand as Ninja Gaiden was because of their amazing work on the indie scene. But whenever .emu run like publisher sales, I love seeing it when indie games support indie games, because when everybody supports indie games, we all win. There is no loser. It's very rare that I'll come across like a whiff of an indie game. Like there's a lot of, to put it bluntly, garbage and shovelware that gets put on these digital storefronts a lot of the time. But in terms of like, if a half decent publisher puts out a unique looking indie game, odds are that it's going to have something interesting and unique to say. Whereas that isn't always the case with, Black Ops 7, I guess. Yeah. I don't know what Black Ops 7 is saying. And I love the odd Call of Duty game, don't get me wrong. But in terms of nutritional value, indie games are the way to go more often than not.
Yeah, 100%. I think from our perspective as well, the fact that these indie developers are keeping these classic systems alive, like Nintendo are not making SNES games anymore, and no one's making the Amiga games outside of the indie scene. So I think it is great that they are keeping the systems that we love, fueled with new games as well, and long may that continue. And Aaron, it's been great to have you on and hear a bit of the history of the indie scene, and also your new book as well, available now from bitmapbooks.com. I'll link that in the show notes as well. Any plans for a volume 2 or anything? Any ideas what's coming up next?
I'm still in the afterglow of the first book right now, but I will say, and I knew this was going to happen prior to launch, like the number one question I get asked when the initial game list was revealed for the book is, why isn't X game included? Yep. Why isn't X game included? And there's only 50 games available, guys. There are only 50 slots. I've included 16 honorable mentions just to try and tick off some of those. But in a way, because the funny thing is that when they do say, oh, where's X game? It's always a different game. And nobody can tell me, well, this game doesn't belong in the book. So it's like, well, what do? Do you replace a game that's already in the book for the game that you want, that matters to you? So yeah, not a definitive list by any means, and that was a very conscious fact. But no plans yet for a book 2. But if this one does well enough, another 50 indie games that change the world rolls off the tongue nicely, I'd say. Yeah,
make it easy to do another 50. Probably do another 20 volumes easy.
There you go. That's my pension sort of right there. That's my retirement plan.
Well, Aaron, best of luck with the book. Ravi and I both read it. I think you've got a great broad range of titles in there as well that really captures the indie scene over the last few decades, and for our audience, lots of retro in there as well. So thanks for coming on and being our guest this week, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. Been a pleasure.